Hi, everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we have been exploring topics of history, religion, and culture. And of course, we have our sort of sideways reference here to Greek mythology and the gods on Mount Olympus, and our attempt to be as impartial in our judgment as they were. However, we don't always succeed in that, but we try. We do our best. My name is Coel Campo.
And my name is Mike Pierce, and this is the fourth episode in our series on secularization, except, of course, we're not calling it that, because otherwise nobody would click on this at all. We're going, fighting free of God. And last week we were looking at one of the two most important Enlightenment-derived ideologies that change the way that people think about themselves, the categories in terms of which they think, and help to the secularization of Western populations, and that was nationalism. And this week we're looking at its great rival, socialism. And just to grab everybody's attention, we call this godless socialism.
Yeah, how godless is socialism though? Because I know of some people who would think that it's really like the manifestation of true Christianity, right? With like everybody, sharing resources and everybody being equal in society.
Right. Yes. This is a very tricky question. I would maintain, those who know me or have been listening to these podcasts for a while would be expecting this perhaps from me now, that Christianity is not the basis for any political program of any kind, left, right, or upside down, because it's not a way of running society. That's just not what it is. Does it instruct disciples to have a particular concern for the poor? It certainly does, to share with those in need and so on. But that is not really what socialism's after in any case. Socialists are after a program for running society as a whole. So certainly I don't agree with the take of those people on Christianity, but that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily their enemy. That would be a very separate sort of discussion. Not necessarily on theological grounds any more than I would disagree with someone coming from what might now count as a right-wing agenda or something like that, or a free market agenda, or that sort of thing. Those discussions, I would maintain, are actually separate.
Mm.
But we're not concentrating necessarily on the rights and wrongs of this. We're simply noticing what has happened and trying to explain how Western societies have become secularized. And in that process, socialism it's not the most important element, but it's one of the more important ones. So that's, of course, why we're looking at this. Now, it seems a sensible place to start, of course, in considering socialism, with the man who, though he didn't necessarily invented socialism, certainly invented its most virulent form, and that's Karl Marx. And we've got here a quotation from classic Greek literature about Prometheus. He was the guy who was condemned by the gods to spend all eternity chained to a rock with birds coming to peck out his liver, and he's railing against the gods. In a word, I hate all the gods. Now, Karl Marx actually takes that quotation and makes it the frontispiece for his doctoral dissertation at the University of Jena in 1841, which was a pretty edgy thing to do. That was the year when he concluded, definitely in his own mind, that he was an atheist. Well, we've got a picture of him here, recently colorized. I'm not sure whether they've done a great job in. I kind of like old colorized photos, and I'm not sure this is the best one I've ever seen. But
He looks a bit gray, doesn't he?
he was great. By the time it was taken, yeah. In 1875, so he would have been, 57 years old. So, yes. Whilst he is not necessarily at the fountainhead of socialism, there were socialist thinkers before Marx. Really, he crystallizes lots of these thoughts in more of an ideological program, in perhaps its most drastic form, that we call communism or Marxism after him. And perhaps it makes some sense to move in at this early point on his critique of religion. taken here from a pamphlet with a riveting title of Towards the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law. Dear, dear me. But actually, most of his writing is pretty turgid. So he says the basis of irreligious criticism is that man makes religion, religion does not make man. So he wants to say that religion comes from the human world, and we're not created by God. I mean, he doesn't say that. He says religion does not make man. But of course, the Christian claim had been that God makes man. This is a category that Marx kind of rules out or simply ignores. But man is not an abstract being crouching outside the world. Man is the world of men, the society, this society, whichever one it is that we're living in, produce religion. Religion is the general theory of that world, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, its general ground of consolation and justification. Now, those two words there, consolation and justification, are like the twin tracks in Marx's critique of religion. So, on the one hand, religion consoles people who are suffering, particularly the poor or the oppressed, by saying, there is a God who loves you, and there will be pie in the sky when you die. Right? And they will put all of this right. And he objects to it on those grounds because it's pacifying people who are suffering rather than letting them get angry and perhaps put things right. But it's also a justification. So, through much of history, states and rulers have used religion as the basis for their claim to power, that they were appointed by God, or that it's the will of God or of the gods that they should rule, or that it's the will of God that their subjects should obey them, this kind of thing. So it's the justification for a particular political and economic order, and it's the consolation for those who are suffering. So the struggle against religion is, therefore, indirectly, the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. So Marx wants to overthrow all existing political and economic conditions because those things justify themselves with reference to religion, and they're helped at the grassroots with the consolatory effects of religion. He wants to sweep religion aside because he wants to sweep aside the entire structure.
Mm.
Religion is the sigh of the afflicted creature, the soul of a heartless world, as it is also the spirit of spiritless conditions. It is, and here comes the famous phrase, the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness.
Now, this seems kind of strange because who is he to insist that he knows what constitutes everyone else's real happiness?
Well, exactly. He is doing exactly what he said was impossible a few lines up.
Right.
He said that man is not an abstract being crouching outside the world. Man is the world of men, the state, society. But he's now mentally positioning himself as precisely that, outside the world, looking in, judging it, and able to define what constitutes real happiness. Yes, exactly so.
Hmm.
The demand to abandon the illusions about their condition is the demand to give up a condition that requires illusions. Now, that and the previous sentence, leaving aside the very important point you just made there, those are very, very powerful sentences, actually. Abolishing religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. The demand to abandon the illusions about their condition. And what he would say is, look, this is the only world there is. This is the only world you've got. And if you've got horrible conditions now, the only chance for happiness is to overthrow existing conditions. Religious happiness is an illusory happiness. That's what he would want to say. Hence, criticism of religion is, in embryo, a criticism of this veil of tears whose halo is religion.
So this would kind of go along with people who make that statement. I can't remember exactly how it goes. Something like so heavenly minded that you're of no earthly good.
Right, right. I mean, that's a frequent point made about people, sometimes even by Christians themselves, but more often about very otherworldly kinds of Christians. Yes.
Right.
Well, he would say that's true right across the board of religious believers, all of them, right? Because they're looking towards heaven, and he's saying there's no point in looking there because there isn't one. Okay, so he's rejecting Christianity then, not really on intellectual grounds. I mean, he certainly does reject it on those grounds, but he doesn't have a lot to say about it. He wouldn't enter into the kind of apologetics discussions that we had in previous episodes, for example, right? He would quickly, impatiently hear the spokesman for Christianity making whatever kind of argument and say, yes, but look at religion as a social phenomenon and how it actually functions socially. And he would want to say, well, so we don't need it. So when he completed his doctorate at Jena, he's definitely an atheist. He doesn't agree with his fellow atheists, though, that if the state was made secular, religion would disappear, because the example of the United States indicated the opposite.
Yeah, because even in 1841, America was already like teeming with religious energy and all manner of new religious groups.
Yes, yes. I mean, America in the 19th century it's absolutely bubbling over with revivals, the Second Great Awakening in the first 2 or 3 decades of the century, new groups forming all the time. Some of them heretical, of course, like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, but loads of new denominations. Some of them imported as waves of immigrants come in, new colleges being founded, all this kind of stuff.
Mm.
So yes, he could point quite rightly to the US and say, well, if making the state secular is going to get rid of religion, well, there's no chance of that happening at all. What he concluded was that society itself must be made secular. So something rather more radical than simply tinkering with our constitutional setups, as in America. Well, from 1843, having already become an atheist, he then becomes a strict materialist in his thinking.
And this is a philosophical definition, right?
Right. He's saying that matter is all that exists, and all the rest of the stuff is just things that we make up for ourselves, generally to justify our own material, therefore economic interests. So he thinks that religion, as he says, has no content of its own and doesn't live from heaven. There's no revelation. It comes from earth and falls automatically with dissolution of the inverted reality whose theory it is. What does he mean by an inverted reality? Well, he's saying we have our own material economic interests and we find reasons to justify them. Where if we are property owners or we're amongst the wealthy, we justify that ownership. If we are not and we want big changes, we want to make arguments for that. And we project those ideas, perhaps moral ideas, into an imaginary heaven and then reflect them back onto the earth and say this is the will of God or of the gods. So he's saying that that's actually an inverted reality.
Basically, another way of people getting what they want by using religion.
Yes. And of course, the embarrassment for religious believers, including today, even though Marxism is generally exploded and believed in by very few people now, is that there is quite a lot of power in this analysis, right? People really do that with religion, not just in the present, but in the past. We could go into some detail about that, but I'm afraid we might run out of time. But it would not be difficult using Marx's kind of arguments to show that, for example, the hierarchy of the medieval church reflected and sanctified the extremely complex hierarchy of medieval feudalism, and that the Protestant Reformation simplifies this a little to reflect the changed economy, the emergence of an urban merchant class. So it does kind of work. Um, what I like to say, I may have said this in a previous podcast, if so, forgive me, is that Marxism explains everything about religion except, of course, the religious part. It can't explain why people act flat contrary to their economic or even social self-interest out of discipleship and following Jesus. And the Marxist or the atheist would have to fall back on all kinds of highly speculative and convoluted arguments to take account of that.
Right, because
So,
he never like attempts to disprove Christianity himself, right?
no, he doesn't. No. He thinks that he's being extremely practical. One of his most famous lines is that the philosophers, up to his own time, have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And Owen Chadwick, whom we're going to mention several times today, a wonderful, wonderful church historian, comments that Marx is then basically an anti-intellectual. He doesn't want to enter into the philosophical game, as it were, or let alone the metaphysical or theological game. He's interested in religion as phenomenon rather than its actual content. And I find it kind of interesting and rather sinister, actually, that in the very secular school curricula that we have in a number of Western countries today, where religion is taught or taught about at all, it is taught as social phenomenon rather than the content of religious beliefs.
Right.
That's very bothersome. So Marx and following him, the Marxists, always insisted that people's ideas and culture and morals were what they called superstructure on the solid base of economics. Because they are strict materialists, economics, Marx insists, drives everything. And so all this other stuff, whether it's religion, culture, or morals, or anything else, is simply floating on the top of that. Morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness have no independence. They have no history, no development. Good gracious, did he really think that? That's self-evidently nonsense. But anyway, but men developing their material production as the economy changes, as our technology improves, they alter, along with their real existence, their thinking and the products of their thinking. So he's saying our ideas change as our material circumstances change. So this is kind of a sophisticated form of the rather childish arguments that you remember from the playground when you were in school, when you were about 7 or 8 years old, as one kid says to another, "You're only saying that because." Right, as if there's some rationalistic and generally material explanation for what you just said, whereas the kid who's tearing you down is pure rationality, standing outside of all this himself, rather like Marx.
Mm-hmm.
So Marxism then could be considered, and Owen Chadwick argues this, as a sort of half philosophy, half economics. Chadwick comments that revolution must be against religion because religion is an essential part of the social structure which revolution must overthrow. But it will not need to fight religion because it will create a society free of alienation and so deprive religion of its root.
What does Chadwick and therefore Marx mean by alienation here?
Well, alienation is one of Marx's favourite words. And what he's saying is basically that because the worker is not working really for himself, I mean, he is, but only in the most convoluted sense. He has to go out to work to get wages, but he's not actually producing goods for his own immediate benefit. He's producing for an employer, and he feels alienated from his work. You're working in a machine, and I think Chadwick gives the example of someone, turning a nut with a spanner and doing the same thing hundreds or thousands of times in a day, right? That kind of work is extremely alienating. It's not the same as someone, I don't know, making furniture for his own house or for a customer who might want to come and buy it, right? It's highly abstracted sort of work. Now, Marx himself succumbed to romanticism a bit here. He postulated that after the revolution, people would do some sort of fulfilling work in the morning, and they would go hunting in the afternoon and take part in literary criticism in the evening or something like that. I think I'm only partly remembering that correctly, but it's along those lines, and that hardly seems to be possible, particularly in the industrial age, and only scarcely now.
Right.
So Marxism, says Chadwick, was the most powerful philosophy of secularization in the 19th century. Its power was based partly upon philosophical axioms that Marx propounded, and partly upon theories of contemporary economics. And one of his most famous works, of course, is Das Kapital, or Capital, which is his theory about how capitalism functioned. And if you look through it, it's kind of, well, impressionistically, maybe about a quarter or a third sound insight, and the rest of it is increasingly flaky. There were many attempts to put this theory into practice in the 20th century, and the 20th century rather proved that. So sometimes this argumentation looks like the celebrated device of academics when, arguing upon an obscure point of the agenda, they seek to show how all history leads towards the precise policy which they advocate. I mean, I find this kind of hilarious. Chadwick is clearly drawing on his own experience of faculty meetings in the university, right? By this half Hegelian, half economic route, he arrived at an Olympian theory where religion didn't even need controverting.
Oh no, not an Olympian theory. He would have fit right in with our podcast.
Oh no, what a dreadful thought. But clearly he did think that he was, as we noticed a few minutes ago, kind of standing outside the world, passing judgment upon it, right?
Right.
Even though he's saying that we can't do that we live within society, except, of course, for Marx himself.
Of course.
Chadwick summarizes in another one of his books, one of his less good ones, actually, I would say, but nevertheless is a brilliant summary. This is his book about the Christian church in the Cold War. So his summary of Marxist views on religion, that it's backward looking, it provided erroneous views of the world, it divided society by unnecessary internal barriers, it drew young people into unproductive work, as priests or monks or nuns. It discouraged the real improvement of society by turning minds to a dream world. It was an expression of bourgeois attitudes because Marx wanted to insist that morality was basically a support for middle-class bourgeois society. He wanted to say that there was no such thing as morality because all there is material interests. Which is interesting because, of course, a lot of the appeal of socialists of all kinds, and certainly including Marxists, was a sense of outrage at the poverty of the poor. Well, on their own principles, you could just fold your arms and say, well, what is there to be angry about? You don't think there is such a thing as morality. And, of course, that religion acts as a brake upon justice for the proletariat.
Yeah, and the proletariat being the industrial working class, he didn't really care about the
Yes.
peasants at all, did he?
No, he didn't actually. He talked about the idiocy of rural life, that peasants are hardly aware of what's going on in the world. For him, it was the industrial workers, the proletariat in Marxist jargon, who are going to be the engine of revolution. It's not just the poor across the board, it is the industrial working class. Yes. Well, as a little bit of a sideways look, but an important one, we should look at Michael Bakunin, who is a theorist of Russian anarchism. Now, anarchism runs close to Marxism, and in the earliest period, including their lifetimes, they seemed like they were part of the same cause, but they did fall out with one another very badly. Bakunin was born to a Russian noble family, though you wouldn't think that to look at him. He looks as though he's been dragged through a hedge backwards. This is at least partly affectation, I think. He lived most of his life in exile in Paris and Dresden and so on. When he was in Russia, he was imprisoned in St. Petersburg and then later on in Siberia for 8 years, but not very harshly, and escaped with connivance from jailers and so on. He got out without much difficulty through the east of Russia, because he's in Siberia, to Japan, got a boat across to the US, crossed America, and ended up back in Europe. And he led a minority faction at the International Working Men's Association in 1872, which was like a forerunner of the Communist International. And at that gathering, he opposed Marx. Marx supported participating in parliamentary elections as one possible route to bring socialists to power. If that didn't work, he had revolution also in his pocket as well. But participate in parliamentary elections, at least as a way of publicising the socialist cause. Bakunin didn't think you should do that. He thought there would be a general uprising by the population everywhere, which is extremely impractical. There's been a tendency of most people who aren't really familiar with anarchism simply to laugh at it as being wildly impractical. And of course it is. But actually, anarchists were an important part of the radical left down to, well, at least down to World War II, particularly in Spain. So Bakunin's thought was influential. And some of the things he says here, we just got half a dozen little quotations from him, will sound familiar to some of our viewers. So people go to church, says Bakunin, for the same reason they go to a tavern, to stupefy themselves, to forget their misery, to imagine themselves, for a few minutes anyway, free and happy.
This is like the same as Marx's opium of the people, right?
Yes, it drugs you. It gives you a false sense of being happy. The first revolt, he says, is against the supreme tyranny of theology, of the phantom of God. As long as we have a master in heaven, we will be slaves on earth. So he thinks that talking about God in this way kind of justifies having masters on the earth. A boss in heaven is the best excuse for a boss on earth. Therefore, if God did exist, he'd have to be abolished.
This one is funny because if God does exist, who has the power to abolish him? Bakunin thinks he does?
Right, yeah. I mean, it's absurd, but it shows that a lot of this is passion rather than the strict rationalism that it sets itself up as being.
Right.
And my particular whipping boy for mockery is the next sentence. Anyone who makes plans for after the revolution is a reactionary. So at one level, these people are presenting themselves as calling for a revolution in order to make everybody happier and to bring about a better state. But then you need, obviously, if you believe that stuff, you need to think about, well, what is it that we're trying to bring in? And he says, no, you mustn't even think about that. So, because the whole point of this is not really to make the world a better place. It's about to make you feel better about yourself as a cool dude who is against, the oppression of the poor. And that is just perfectly skewers the attitude of so many politically minded people right down to the present.
Yeah.
So many whom I have encountered. They don't really have a clue as to how this would work out. And even to discuss it is, well, they can't say unspiritual because they don't believe in God, seriously. But at any rate, somehow second rate. Yeah. It's really about themselves, not about the good of others.
Right.
And their desired self-image. And when I came to America, I found that, because all my life I'd felt that this was the kind of attitudinizing that I'd found only on the left. When I moved to America, I found that, yes, it worked on the left, but it also applied on the right as well, which was an eye-opener for me. Lots of kinds of American right-wingers, the stuff they spout, it's actually about themselves
Yeah.
and their desired self-image.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, if there be a human being who is freer than I, then I shall necessarily become his slave. Okay, conversely, if I am freer than any other, then he will become my slave. All right. Therefore, equality is an absolutely necessary condition of freedom. Now, this is strange because it sounded so logical, and the conclusion it comes to, which does logically follow from the first two sentences, is obviously nonsense. If there is equality, there can't be freedom. It'll have to be imposed. If there really is freedom, we will be unequal because we are unequal. So, yeah, a paradox to say the least. And then the last one is a sentence that I think loads of people will be familiar with, used not just by anarchists, but all kinds of left wingers, from each according to his faculties or abilities, to each according to his needs. Okay, well, let's move on a little because were all socialists in this period necessarily atheistic, like Marx, and Engels, like Bakunin? And the answer, of course, is no. Now, Methodism had begun in the 18th century, led by Wesley. It was a movement within the Church of England, as, even by the standards of that day, very conservative. And even after Wesley's death, it continued in the same vein. But it was very much a confession or denomination which drew loads of its support in industrial places amongst industrial workers. After Wesley's death, it was partly kicked out of the Church of England, partly jumped in 1795. And so it started to drift, at least some individuals started to drift a little bit leftwards. Well, this is seen most notably in someone who's a real outlier during his own day, but it becomes a little bit more of a pattern as the 19th century wears on. And it's this strange fellow, Joseph Rayner Stephens. A biography of his life, Purge This Realm, was brought out by Michael Edwards about 20 years ago now, maybe a bit more, I think. And he was certainly a firebrand amongst Methodist preachers. So here is an excerpt of a speech he gives to Lancashire mill workers. To be justified means, in a few plain words, to be set right. To be set right with God, to be set right with man. If that be the meaning of it, and your own ministers will not deny that it is the meaning of it.
Yeah, this sounds like Stevens knows he's a lone voice in this.
Yes, yes. The other ministers won't agree with him, but he says, even they'll agree with me on this. Right? Put it to them whether any mill owner in their society is justified by faith. He cannot be justified. He cannot have things set right between God and himself. All is crooked between him and God. All is wrong between him and his people. And so long as he continues a mill owner in the present state and under the present system of trade, he must be on the high road to everlasting damnation. Do you ask me why? Because he makes free with that which does not belong to him. Your bodies and souls are God's and not your master's. And as long as the mill owner does to them what is likely to hurt them, have them working incredibly long hours, keeping them at low wages, often mill hands are staying in company housing, which is often wretched. As long as he does to them what is likely to hurt them, he's guilty in the sight of God of blood. Is he ever told that? Never, never, never. The minister in whose society or congregation he belongs would rather have one mill owner in his congregation than 1,000 spinners.
And this last part, presumably, is because voluntary churches depend on members paying into the collection box.
Right, yes. They can't fall back on institutional wealth like in a Church of England. So, yeah, they depend on the money that the congregation gives, as we still find in most churches today, right? And that means if remains a temptation today, if you're a pastor and someone very well off joins your congregation, you want to keep them because their contributions are likely to be pretty big. So don't say anything to upset them. And that kind of dynamic plays into the hands of socialist agitators, whether they are religious, like Stevens, or whether they are secularist. So the general trend of Methodism, certainly in this period, things did change later in the century quite a bit, is towards some kind of conservatism as a break upon the workers' movement. Now, Elie Halevi was a French historian of 19th century Britain, an Anglophile. He was particularly interested in Britain's political thinkers. He was a Protestant, although his family had Jewish roots. And he coined in the early 20th century, in his very influential 6-volume history of the English people in the 19th century, the so-called Halevi thesis. And he says this: if economic facts explain the course taken by the human race, the England of the 19th century was surely, above all other countries, destined to revolution, both politically and religiously. Why should this be so? Well, because England was the first industrial country. It was industrializing very fast. Its wealth was exploding, but also it was creating horrible new living conditions for a very large proportion of its population, the urban working class, who were working in dangerous conditions, had horrible housing, short life expectancies, living in very unhealthy environments. This surely would have been a predictor of political upheaval. And Britain certainly did have very serious troubles during the 19th century, but none of them ever really came close to revolution. Just when things were starting to look pretty sketchy, always the corner was turned in time. And this is the core of Halevi's thesis. Methodism was the antidote to Jacobinism. Jacobinism, the creed of the French revolutionaries. So what he's saying is that the Halevi thesis is summarized as that Methodism saves Britain from an equivalent of the French Revolution.
So Methodism is basically like the religious version of Marxism, not in values, but in its empathy for the working class.
Yes, what Hove is saying is that it's giving out the opposite values. It's providing precisely the kind of consolation to the workers that Marx so detested. Right. Well, a very influential historian of more recent years is E.P. Thompson. He was a British Marxist, and his most famous book that came out in 1963, but remained an absolute staple of history studies in universities for, well, 30 years. And certainly this stuff was imposed on me as an undergraduate. This was the orthodoxy of my undergraduate days, is the making of the English working class. Now, Thompson had been brought up by a family of Methodist missionaries, and he absolutely detested Methodism. You can see the photo here. He looks quite a jaundiced sort of person, doesn't he?
Yes.
So here is an excerpt from his book in which he's skewering Methodism. I mean, he does this repeatedly throughout this extremely, I forget how many pages it is, about 600 or 700 pages. But this is one of the more notorious passages in it. Nothing was more often remarked by contemporaries of the workaday Methodist character or of Methodist home life than its methodical, its Methodist, disciplined and repressed disposition. It's the paradox of a religion of the heart that it should be notorious for the inhibition of all spontaneity. Methodism sanctioned workings of the heart only upon the occasions of the church. Methodists wrote hymns, but no secular poetry of note. Avoid all manner of passions, advised Wesley. The word is unpleasant, but it's difficult not to see in Methodism in these years a ritualized form of psychic masturbation. Energies and emotions which were dangerous to social order, or which were merely unproductive, were released in the harmless form of sporadic love feasts, watch nights, band meetings, or revivalist campaigns.
This is pretty vicious. Was he paying out his parents for something, possibly?
It's very hard not to conclude that that's exactly what he was doing. Yes, yes. And of course, what he's saying is that Methodism kept the worker, who may be in very difficult working and living circumstances, under an extremely tight rein, getting him to keep control of himself and providing an emotional outlet. But the emotional outlet was only religious in church services. So the church services were kind of like a release valve in which anger could come out as, I don't know, tears or something like this in church, and be expressed in a religious context, but not be released outside of that, and certainly not in political form. So, in an ironic sense, Thompson and Marxists like him are agreeing with Halavy. But whereas Halavy thought this was a good thing, Thompson thinks it's an appalling thing. The Catholic Church, as you might expect, is strongly opposed to any of this. So let's take, for example, Pope Pius IX.
We're back with our friend here from last week. He really doesn't like anything of the modern world, does he?
No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. And he is in his encyclica Nostis et Nobiscum of 1849. So this will have been written in exile, actually. I remember there'd been a revolution in Rome in 1848. He'd had to flee over the southern frontier to the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, and he's not brought back for a couple of years. He's brought back only by a French army. So while he's in exile, he produces this. And mostly he's concerned about Italian nationalism, but while he's about it, he condemns socialism as well. The goal of this most iniquitous plot is to drive people to overthrow the entire order of human affairs and to draw them over to the wicked theories of socialism and communism by confusing them with perverted teachings. But these enemies realize that they cannot hope for any agreement with the Catholic Church. And some years later, because Pius was Pope for a heck of a long time, his immediate successor, Leo XIII, made the same kind of points in his very first year as Pope in 1878. Although the socialists, stealing the very gospel itself with a view to deceive more easily the unwary, have been accustomed to distort it so as to suit their own purposes. Nevertheless, so great is the difference between their depraved teachings and the most pure doctrine of Christ that none greater could exist.
There's something about this that it shows that he's very well aware of the existence of Christian socialists.
Yes, yes. He says that many of the socialists are stealing the gospel to deceive people. So they're expressing themselves in Christian or Christian sounding words. But he's saying, regardless of what they say, regardless of their distortions, there's this huge chasm between what they say and the doctrine of Christ, which, as represented by the Catholic Church, yes. So the Catholic Church sets itself very, very firmly against this. Now, this does not mean the popes supported capitalism. The problem for the papacy is that they opposed the modern world, right? There were also, although fewer admittedly, condemnations of unregulated capitalism. Late in the 19th century, a number of Catholics started Catholic political parties and Catholic trades unions. What the Catholic Church wanted was for the Industrial Revolution just to stop and go backwards and go back to the sort of the idealized world before the Industrial Revolution, a hierarchical world. And obviously that wasn't going to happen. So how to respond to the new situation. Well, perhaps somehow we can have a kind of paternalistic attitude towards urban workers. So these parties and these trade unions were designed to protect workers from capitalists who would defraud them and reduce them to terrible conditions, but without agitating for socialism. But the problem for the papacy in supporting even these was that it didn't really support the universal franchise, that is, votes for all, in the first place.
There's just no way forward for the papacy in this period.
No, there isn't. There isn't. It's absolutely dead set against the modern world. It doesn't like capitalism. It's terrified of socialism. It can't stand nationalism, which threatens it and threatens the dissolution of the most loyal Catholic states like the Austrian Empire. It doesn't want the vote for everybody. So where is it going to go? Well, as I mentioned last week, and I'm sure our viewers are getting sick of these promises by now, we're going to do another series on the agony of the Catholic Church from the French Revolution to the 1960s. It was a torturous path indeed, yeah. And in the 20th century, these Catholic parties were generally centrist, a sort of middle way between capitalism and socialism, although not really liking either. But after World War II, they tended to become centre right Christian Democrats, for example, in West Germany and Italy. The Italian Christian Democrat Party has collapsed over the last 20 years or so, but for a long time it was there and was important. In Germany, it's still doing really well. So they are more centre right, although one notices that those parties are woollier, more centrist even than the British Tories, never mind than American Republicans. So that's down to their background, where they come from. Well, all these theorizers aside, politicos, churches, Marxist agitators, what about the actual workers themselves? What did they think? Well, this brings us back to our man Owen Chadwick and his book on changing attitudes, changing beliefs amongst ordinary people during this period.
Yeah, and he's got some really catchy book title here.
Yes, yes. I mean, this is. I like to urge students to read this, but at first I apologised for the title because that's an absolutely terrible title. It sounds like it's going to be so dull, and there's not a dull sentence in it. Right? It's really a terrific read. So, and you'll get something of the flavour of that even from this passage. So, the slum dweller of the later 19th century had no sense of guilt in not attending churches or chapels. If he professed atheism, he might be aggressive, but mostly he professed no such thing. He took no notice unless he listened amusedly to a street orator, say a Salvation Army preacher on a street corner or something. When minister or district visitor called on him to ask him, why haven't you been to church? He might proffer faint excuse, but his attitude needed no excuse. The excuse was but courtesy. Religion was not and never had been for the likes of him. This indifference was assured. It came with neither guilt nor bitterness as companion. What he's saying is, if our typical slum dweller had been brought up in a godly home but had decided didn't want any more to do with it, it would come with guilt, this indifference. Or if he was reacting against religion, say being influenced by Marxism, he would be angry and bitter. But neither of those things, he's saying, was true for most of them, most of the time. And from this assurance, long tradition is arguable. What he's telling us is that because of this attitude, it seems likely that the poorest of the poor, the slum dwellers, had not been engaged with churches for several generations. And he would seem to be right.
Yeah, I see this as kind of like the birthplace of nominal Christianity.
Yes, yes. Well, maybe not at that level, maybe just one layer above that, amongst the ordinary, Not people right at the bottom in the slums, but just above that. Yes, yes. Well, it would perhaps serve us well to note the origin of the word secularism. And we're staying with Chabrik here. He points out that socialist propaganda suffered from its association with atheist propaganda. In other words, it made it harder to persuade people to socialist opinions because loads of people thought that this was connected somehow with atheism, which of course in Marxism it was. So protagonists of socialism could more easily persuade men to join them in a social program if they refrained from propounding atheism. And he looks at the examples of George Holyoake, who was precisely such a campaigner and himself an atheist, and Charles Bradlaugh, who was the first atheist to become an MP in Britain, a member of Parliament, though there were protracted legal cases, if I remember correctly, before he could do that because he couldn't take the standard oath to become a member of Parliament, and so there was a lot of politicking around that, and in the end he succeeded. So George Holyoake said that he no longer wished to be called an atheist nor infidel, even though he was, since, he said, Christians understand by that term one who is unfaithful or treacherous to the truth. And in 1851, he put into the English language the word secularism. At first, the word secularism needed explanation as concerning itself with this world, the issues of which can be tested in this life. So he's kind of drawing back from declaring himself an atheist, even though he is, because he thinks he can engage more people that way.
He was probably right.
Yeah, he was, yeah. I think by now, most people are not deceived, regardless of whether they themselves are religious or otherwise, by the word secularism. If someone says they're a secularist, then they're almost certainly an atheist or at least an agnostic. Right? But yeah, in this period, it simply meant, well, we're not talking about this. We're just talking about this worldly affairs. Well, now, some points that I'd make myself here. This is from a chapter which is mostly written in a book which is otherwise almost entirely unwritten, and which may eventually appear in print. So this is a project that's been on the go, or perhaps not on the go, for a number of years now. As I say that, I'm reminded of a wonderful comedy sketch from my youth with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and both these guys are reclining on deck chairs on the beach somewhere, and there's this silence for a few seconds, and then one of them says, "I'm writing a book," and then there's another pause of a few seconds, and the other one says, "Neither am I." And yes, tragically, that absolutely skewers the reality. Okay, but this comes from something that is actually written. The religious census of 1851 in Britain is often alluded to as proof positive of the high tide of evangelical influence in mid-Victorian Britain. What had happened was this. On a Sunday of that year, a count was made of church attendees of all denominations. And so the figures have been analysed ever since. Yet at the time, the results shocked everyone, and Anglicans most of all. Only 50% of the population was in church at all that morning, and only half of those were in the Church of England parish churches. Now, since most regular churchgoers then and now aren't there literally every Sunday morning, people get sick or have to look after sick children, especially in 1851, more children and more sick, we can probably add another 10 or 15% and conclude that 60 to 65% of everyone went to church most of the time. Anglicans were appalled, partly because it showed that only half the population was at worship, and even more because their own share was only half of that half, so a quarter then. And yet they're supposed to be the church embracing the whole population. Well, it hadn't been compulsory for a long time, and with the coming of the Industrial Revolution and urbanisation, it's declined and declined. And this census makes that fact statistically plain to them. In rural areas, to be sure, most people still attended their parish churches. In mid-sized towns, however, it was the nonconformist chapels, Methodist, Baptist, Congregational, Quaker, Unitarian, etc. Unitarians are not Orthodox Christians, but they were an important denomination both in Britain and at least in New England during this period. But in mid-sized towns, those are the ones that had the lion's share of support. In the very largest cities, such as London, attendance at any kind of church or chapel on a given Sunday morning had already become a minority activity in 1851. Seen from an Anglican perspective, the Industrial Revolution was proving a secularizing phenomenon, and the wicked nonconformists, far from being the religiously reviving force of their own self-perception, were proving to be merely a halfway house to secularization.
So this sounds like something we've looked at before and an extension of the Catholic argument that the Reformation leads in the end to secularism.
Yes, yes, it is. So the more traditional aspects of society in the countryside, people are still adhering to the official church. In the Blackburns and the Burnleys and the cloth towns, they're going to the Methodists and the Baptists and so on. And in the really big cities, they're becoming completely secular. But yeah, Catholics would argue that Protestantism in the long run would lead to the undoing of Christendom, particularly with the focus on the individual conscience before God. And then you get the rise of sectarianism, which intensifies that. So, in its own mind, it's about intense religious experience. But in fact, all that's doing is by reducing things to the emphasis to feelings and personal convictions, is it's opening the doorway to secularization of the bulk of society as a whole. And that would seem to bear that out, yes. Well, turning back to Chadwick again, what about the actual workers? Churches, he says, being of man and therefore made of the dust of the earth, as well as the breath of the divine, are always entangled with the culture and structure of their age. And when the culture and structure of an age is shattered by the new economic and or intellectual conditions, churches are liable to be shattered with the rest of the social structure. The industrial worker's attitude to religion might be friendly or favourable or hostile. Religion he could use. Churches he hardly felt that he could use. The feeling that atheism and socialism were related was very slow to win the European working man, and probably it never won more than a relatively small number of dedicated theorists or preachers. So Marxists and communist agitators, those kinds of people. But ordinary working people, no, they weren't persuaded by this, but they were separated from churches. So to summarise then, there are two socialist criticisms of the churches, and they are completely different. The first one is the churches are not living up to the teachings of Christ, for example, by failing to be supportive of the workers' political struggles or even condemning those struggles. And the conflicting critique is the Marxist line that the churches were indeed being faithful to Christian teaching, and it was Christianity itself that was the enemy of socialism and of workers' interests. Well, with the exception of radical ideologues, the large majority of working class people took the first view, and that inclined them in the long run to a churchless support for religion. But by the mid 20th century, that tended to generate secular populations. So people who continue to think of themselves as Christians, even though they, well, as my father said, he didn't support organized religion. He would have called himself a Christian, but he didn't support organized religion. And that was an incredibly common attitude for his generation. And it's not until the 1960s that kind of fades away in its turn. So a kind of a wedge inserted between religious belief, or at least respect for religion, and actual practice by being part of a church.
So basically, Marxism or even socialism can't really take all the credit for the secularism that is coming about.
Right, right. A lot of that is coming about as a result of social processes, which we analysed in the first episode of this series. But we are spending the rest of this series looking at the intellectual and political changes that actually hasten that process along in undermining religion. So, last episode and this one, we've looked at the two most important Enlightenment-derived political ideologies, nationalism and now socialism, that have that effect. And what we're going to be looking at in our remaining two episodes is the effect of biblical criticism and the undermining of belief in the integrity of the Bible, and at changes in science, particularly Darwinism, and the kind of faith struggles that sets up. Yes.
All right. Well, this was enlightening to use a term that is a favorite of yours. And yeah, so we'll see where this goes next week.
Okay, well, if you like this episode, or indeed if you hated it, be sure to post it on social media and tell everybody how wonderful, or beziehungsweise, as the Germans would say, how terrible and dreadful you think it was, contemptible. But please do tell other people about it. And thank you for staying with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye now.